let's bring in my guests now and start our look at those papers. Thanks to you both for joining me. Let's begin with that story in the Gulf news. Bahrain and Israel normalising ties. This is a significant development. The statement released by Israel, Bahrain and the US called it historic development. While we're seeing some coalescing with regard to these efforts by the US, it does still drive a bigger wedge, doesn't it, between Israel and Palestine in that conflict?
It does. And, you know, President Trump wants this to be part of his legacy, the fact that he was able to progress peace in the Middle East. And it is a significant development. But the crux of the problem still remains, you know, the long-standing tensions and conflicts and problems between Israel and Palestine. And the normalization of relationships between Israel and other Arab nations is important. I think until you can find a resolution to that critical problem, it doesn't advance peace in the Middle East in a sustainable, long-lasting way. And in fact, there are many worries, I think, with the Palestinians, that they are worried that countries that should be their friends and allies are normalizing relationships without asking for the resolution of the tensions and conflicts with Palestine as a precondition for normalization of relationships. So, you know, we are making baby steps, but there is still a long, long way to go.
Certainly, as you say, still a long way to go. Let's look at the New York Times. There is a very striking picture on the front page. And of course, this is of those fires that continue to rage. And they've actually got a line here that calls this a reckoning on climate change. Miatta, what was your reaction when you saw the pictures of these fires?
I mean, the pictures are absolutely devastating. And, you know, they are a really sobering, terrifying reminder that climate change is here. And it is absolutely catastrophic in its wake. And, you know, we have been warned by the scientists for some time now that climate change is happening. You know, we've been told that we've got 10 years to take drastic action in order to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. And we are still moving too slowly. And, you know, one of the big risks is that with COVID and so much attention having to be put towards dealing with this crisis, absolutely, is that we forget or deprioritize climate change. And I think, you know, these fires are a reminder that we absolutely can't do that because time is running out. And there is an opportunity in the way that we respond to particularly the economic fallout from COVID, where governments are having to invest and provide fiscal stimulus, that we do it in a way that transitions our economy towards a low carbon one. You know, that is the prize if we get it right. And we cannot and we must not miss that, because the consequences on lives and our communities and our society will be devastating.
Let's turn our attention to the FT. There's another picture of those fires in the US on the front page. I mean, it's such a striking picture again. Just gives you a sense of how severe the situation is. But the story we'll talk about from this paper is on Brexit. And it says here that Boris Johnson was warned on the Brexit deal, and that they were in January there were warnings that this deal would leave Brussels able to claim jurisdiction over large amounts of UK state aid policy. Miatta.
Yes, so, you know, apparently, according to this report, officials made it absolutely clear to the Prime Minister that there was a provision within the withdrawal agreement that would essentially allow the EU a significant amount of say over state aid policy in Northern Ireland, which would then have a knock-on effect on state aid policy in the UK. And the truth is that the Prime Minister was so desperate to get that deal done and dusted, to get Brexit done, to leave, that those warnings clearly weren't heeded. And, you know, the withdrawal agreement was rushed through, despite Parliament saying it needed time to be scrutinised. The government did not want to do that for political reasons. And we now find ourselves in this bizarre situation where a government is looking to undermine an international treaty that it has signed up to. And I mean, it's absolutely mortifying. partly because it undermines our reputation, our credibility internationally. But more importantly, when we are in the midst of a really critical negotiation with the EU that will have an impact on our economics and our way of life for years to come, to be engaging in such an inflammatory course of action seems to me to be completely reckless. And it might seem like a negotiating tactic to them, but for me, it seems like a way to sour a relationship and move us toward no deal.
The Daily Mirror, we've got coronavirus on the front page there, cases doubling in a week. It looked like we were getting back to some kind of normality, but Miatta, these hopes are being snatched away, aren't they?
They are. And look, we knew the virus was still with us, and we knew that there was quite a high risk that we would see another big spike or a second wave. And, you know, the R rate is now, the reproduction rate is now over 1. So it looks like we are headed that way, which, you know, in the end, I think the truth is we're going to be not only discovered, but it's normalized and, you know, given across the population. And even then, we're not clear if we will defeat this thing. And so we have to find ways in which we can contain and live with it. And it comes back to, you know, the absolutely critical importance of test and tracing. And, you know, it's very worrying that in the weeks as we're seeing the number of cases rising, the government is seeing having genuine problems with access to testing. And we're going backwards in terms of our contact tracing. We've got to 80%. Last figures showed that we were closer to 69%. So we've got real problems, and the government has a small window to get a grip on this, because if it doesn't, this thing will get out of control again, and we will go back to having really stringent requirements put on us.
Let's look at the eye weekend. There's a report here, an exclusive report about the army being looked at to help with UK mass vaccinations. I don't know, Miatta, can we dare to hope that this movement means that there might be some good news around the corner?
We can dare to hope, but we know that we are still some way from a vaccine. I mean, I think it's really important that actually there is the planning that's taking place, because even if we do get a vaccine, actually vaccinating the population at a scale that allows us to, you know, constrain the virus will be absolutely critical. So it's right that they're planning. It's right that they're going to have to think about massively ramping up their capacity to do so. But, you know, going back to the Times piece, you know, but until we get there, and we don't know if that's going to be 6 months, a year, 2 years, longer, it is really critical that we get test, trace and isolate right. And, you know, the thing that is, you know, the missing piece is most people do want to do the right thing, but until people are able to afford to do the right thing. So at the moment, you know, if you're having to self-isolate, you're on statutory sick pay, or a lot of people don't even get that. That's like £95 or nothing. A lot of people cannot afford to do the right thing, even if they want to. So if the government wants to fix that problem, it has got to think about how it provides minimum income protection for those that have to self-isolate. If it doesn't do that, we won't get that right. And we have to get it right before we get a vaccine in place.
Let's start with the Daily Mail. Save our children's Christmas. Now, this is interesting. Not all Britons wanted under 12s to be exempt from the rule of 6. Let's start with you, Miatta.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the government is going to come under increasing pressure. The rule of 6 is simple insofar as, you know, it's easy to communicate. We all know what it means. And it kind of moves us beyond a lot of the kind of confusion that we had about what rules apply when coming out of lockdown. I think the difficulty is because Scotland and it appears Wales are taking a slightly different interpretation of the rule, which allows children under the age of 12, children that we know tend to contract the virus less frequently and severely than adults, but also transmit it less. There feels like there's a logic in exempting them, but we haven't done that here. And so I think, you know, backbench MPs are going to be putting a lot of pressure on the PM. I think a lot of people will be wondering what the logic of us having such a stringent interpretation of the rule when others in Scotland don't. And I suspect they're probably going to U-turn on this and replicate what we have in Scotland.
And if we look at the front page of the Daily Mirror, they're also talking about coronavirus and the fact that the cases have doubled in a week. The rate of infection is rising. Other cities and are going into lockdown. Miatta, so far people have been listening to and responding generally quite well to advice. But do you see more negotiating coming ahead in the sense that restrictions are going to have to be debated a little more and people want to understand why even more than before?
I think so, because I think when this was a novelty, there was a sense that, we didn't really understand what was happening. A lot of people, hadn't engaged with the sort of science behind COVID and what we should do or shouldn't do. So there was quite a lot of compliance. And I think it is wearing thin for a lot of people. So I think, the government has to pivot its strategy. If you want people to be adhering to really strict restrictions, which I believe will be necessary, for a really sustained period. I think that's the key thing. When we went into lockdown, it was only ever going to be a short term, whereas now we're talking about restrictions that will be with us for months on end, potentially years on end. And so you've got to have an honest conversation with, the population that says, this is why we're doing it. These are the trade-offs, and these are the reasons to comply. And be flexible where you can be. But it's a really, really tough balancing act that the government has to put in place. And a big part of that is confidence. And confidence comes when people believe that the government is taking the right measures to constrain this, is putting up the right infrastructure, test and trace, a critical part of that. And until it gets that part of the equation right, it's very, very hard to ask people to, fully comply. Because they will start questioning the validity and the judgment of what the government's doing, which is an absolute disaster in a pandemic.
That's the conversation in the front page of the Daily Star. Dud's Army is what they're calling this, and they've got this this phrase here that Boris Johnson's army of COVID marshals will take to the streets amid fears they'll prove to be powerless busybodies and laughing stocks. Miatta.
It's a bit harsh.
Just a little bit harsh.
Yeah, it's a bit harsh from the start. But, I think underlying, underneath it is a really valid point. So, obviously the government is trying to think about the range of measures it can put in place in order to try and constrain the virus, and in order to get people to comply with the kind of the basic restrictions, of which social distancing is one. And so the idea of these COVID marshals are people that will go and try and make sure that people are keeping space and they're doing the things that they need to. But there is a genuine question about, firstly, who these people are going to be, how are they going to recruit them in time? If you remember the kind of the farce around recruiting people to operate the test and trace system and how long that took, how are we going to get these marshals up and running? And critically, what powers would they actually have to enforce this? And I think actually probably a more sensible route is for the government to probably push enforcement down to local government, who can use, organisations that are already there, whether it's neighbourhood policing, in order to be able to work in communities, to explain to people what the guidance are and to help them adhere. And I think that's probably a far better tact than trying to create an arbitrary army of marshals that it's quite hard to know exactly what they'll be doing and how they'll be doing it.
Let's change tack a little now and talk about Brexit. The Daily Telegraph has Boris Johnson writing and defending his recent moves. He's issued a direct plea to Tory MPs who are threatening to rebel over his plans, telling them that if they stand in his way, they will reduce the chance of getting a trade deal with the EU. Miatta, what do you make of this whole situation and Boris Johnson's defence?
Well, this article I find really bizarre. The claim is that the EU have either threatened or could threaten to either impose tariffs on goods coming from Northern Ireland into Great Britain, and or worst case scenario could actually put in blockades by refusing to grant Great Britain third party status. Now, look, I don't know how much credibility there is in these claims. And I think it would definitely go against the types of relationship that you hope we will have with the EU, which will be one of kind of partners, long allies and friends, and that would definitely go against the spirit of it. So I don't actually think there's probably that much weight behind the claims that the Prime Minister is making. I think this is an attempt to paint the EU as the bad guys in this negotiation. It's an attempt to rally the supporters and base around the reason for Brexit and the reason why we want to take a hard line with the EU. But I think it's really dangerous. I think, we should be negotiating in good faith. We should be negotiating amicably because a free trade agreement is in both of our interests. And I worry that all of these tactics are inflammatory and they will sour the relationship with our closest trading bloc and ally and set us on course to a no deal, which when we have the economy on its knees would be the most reckless thing that any government could do. And I just hope that all economic reason, but actually in the end, genuine care for the country ensures that that is not the course that they take, because it would, in the current context, be unbelievable if that's where we end up.
The Daily Express, Boris saying we've only just begun. Trade negotiators confident that Britain will thrive outside the EU as that deal is signed with Japan, £15 billion. But Miatta, in context, just how much of a dent will that make?
Look, it's a good news story for the government and the Prime Minister. It's good that they've made progress on a trade deal with Japan, but the net impact of this is 0.07% of GDP over 15 years. And that's not, it's not inconsequential, but you have to compare it against the loss in terms of GDP of both extricating ourselves from the EU, which has a loss anyway, but if we do end up in a kind of no deal scenario, or we do end up failing to negotiate a free trade deal with the EU, the cost of that will completely blow out of the water the net benefit of this trade deal. So, it seems very odd to me that if the government is so determined for us to be global Britain, to have all these trade deals, that they wouldn't be putting a little bit more energy and effort into negotiating the deal with our biggest trading bloc right on our doorstep.
Looking at the sport page of The Guardian, and Klopp is saying he wants to bring fans back to stadiums. Miatta, I don't know if you're a football fan, but his argument is that football plays a crucial role in bringing joy to people's lives. But perhaps that depends on whether your team's winning or losing.
Absolutely. And, I think this just sums up the complete nightmare that the government's going to have because, we were supposed to be moving towards trialling, if you like, COVID-compliant, COVID-safe fan at stadiums. But it looks as, the R rate increases, as the number of cases increases, that the government is unlikely to move on this. And it comes back to the crux of the matter. For some time to come, we're going to have these trade-offs between, the things that we like to do in our lives and keeping this thing under control for public health grounds. And it's an absolutely miserable place to be. It's impossible for any government to do. But unfortunately, that's the world in which we find ourselves. And, for me, the thing that has to be paramount is public health, because if we get that wrong, it has huge, huge repercussions on everything else.